To feed her children, a beggar woman agrees to bathe a blind millionaire. The blind millionaire despises her help, not knowing who she really is. But the truth between them could destroy everything. What he does will leave you in shock. Alexander Pierce stood at the window of his penthouse office, his manicured fingers pressed against the cool glass as he surveyed the Manhattan skyline. At 52, he had built Pierce Enterprises into a billion-dollar tech empire, and every glittering skyscraper before him seemed to bow in deference to his success. The afternoon sun caught his expensive watch, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the wall, a fitting metaphor for the dazzling life he had crafted. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes, Mr. Pierce." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Hamilton is already waiting in the conference room." Victoria Hamilton. The thought of his fiancée brought a smile to his face. She was everything he'd wanted in a partner, brilliant, beautiful, and as ambitious as he was. Their wedding, scheduled for next month, was set to be the social event of the year. If this story caught your interest, watch until the end and subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. "I'll be right there," he responded, straightening his custom-made Italian suit. The quarterly meeting was a mere formality. Nobody dared to challenge his vision anymore. 25 years of ruthless business acumen had taught the corporate world that Alexander Pierce didn't make mistakes. The hallway to the conference room stretched before him like a red carpet, his footsteps echoing against marble floors that had cost more than most people's homes. Employees' heads turned as he passed, a mixture of fear and admiration in their eyes. He had cultivated that response carefully over the years. The first sign that something was wrong came when he reached for the conference room door handle and missed. He blinked, confused. The handle seemed to blur and shift before his eyes. Shaking his head, he reached again, this time gripping it firmly. 20 faces turned toward him as he entered, but their features seemed oddly indistinct. Victoria's voice cut through the haze. "Alex, are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," he said sharply, but the words felt thick in his mouth. The presentation screen at the front of the room was becoming a white smear. He gripped the back of his chair, trying to steady himself. The third quarter projections show the CFO's voice seemed to come from underwater. Alexander squinted, trying to make out the numbers on the screen, but they danced and swirled before his eyes. A murmur of concern rippled through the room. "Mr. Pierce?" Someone touched his arm. He jerked away, but the movement sent the room spinning. His precise, controlled world began to tilt on its axis. "I can't," he started to say, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing he saw clearly was Victoria's perfectly manicured hand reaching toward him as he stumbled. Then everything went when the darkness, he would later learn, was permanent. The doctors called it anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, a sudden loss of blood flow to the optic nerve. A rare condition, they explained, their voices careful and clinical, sometimes triggered by extreme stress or underlying health conditions. The damage is irreversible. In the weeks that followed, Alexander learned new words: adaptation, accessibility, assistance. Words that had never been part of his vocabulary, words that felt like surrender. His world, once measured in quarterly reports and profit margins, shrank to the space he could touch with his hands. Victoria stayed through the initial hospital stay, her heels clicking purposefully across the floor as she managed his care with the same efficiency she brought to corporate mergers. But he could hear the strain in her voice, the way she hesitated before touching him, as if his condition might be contagious. "The board is concerned," she told him one evening, her voice carefully neutral. "They're suggesting a temporary leave of absence while you adjust." "Temporary?" His laugh was bitter. "We both know there's nothing temporary about this." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. He couldn't see her face, but he could picture the calculation happening behind her eyes. Victoria hadn't gotten where she was by allowing sentiment to cloud her judgment. "Alex," she began, then stopped. He waited, his unseeing eyes fixed on where he thought she stood. "Maybe we should postpone the wedding, just until we figure things out." "Postpone?" Another harsh laugh. Why don't you say what you really mean, Victoria? Your 5-year plan didn't include playing nurse to a blind man. That's not fair. But her voice had already shifted, taken on the tone she used for difficult business negotiations. I'm trying to be practical. The company needs strong leadership right now. The shareholders are nervous. Your condition? It changes things. Everything changes things, he said quietly. It was the most honest thing he'd said since losing his sight. In the darkness, he could finally see the truth of their relationship, a merger of ambitions rather than hearts. The next day, Victoria didn't come. Instead, his assistant delivered a letter. He could smell her familiar perfume on the envelope, and a press release announcing the postponement of their engagement. The assistant read both to him, her voice trembling slightly, then fled before he could respond. Alone in his hospital room, Alexander Pierce, the man who had built an empire on his ability to see opportunities others missed, faced a future he couldn't see at all. The irony would have made him laugh if he had remembered how. The first week back in his penthouse apartment was a lesson in humility. Alexander Pierce, who once commanded boardrooms with a mere glance, now struggled to find his way to his own bathroom. The space that had once been a showcase of his success, featured in architectural magazines and admired by the elite of New York, had become a maze of unseen obstacles and unexpected corners. The marble floors he'd once admired now felt treacherous under his feet. His collection of modern art, worth millions, had been reduced to flat surfaces his hands occasionally brushed against. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had once offered him commanding views of the city now only provided warmth when the sun struck them, a sensation that helped him track the passing of days he could no longer see. "Mr. Pierce," the voice belonged to Lisa, the third home health aide he'd had in as many weeks. "Your breakfast is ready and you have several calls to return." He didn't respond immediately, his hands gripping the back of his leather armchair. The previous 2 aides had quit, one citing his temper, the other his impossible expectations. He couldn't bring himself to care. They treated him like an invalid, and their pitying tones made him want to scream. "The board members have been calling," Lisa continued, her voice careful. "And Miss Hamilton's office. Tell them I'm unavailable," he cut her off. Victoria hadn't visited once since their conversation in the hospital. Instead, she communicated through carefully worded emails and messages delivered by assistants. The press had been having a field day with their postponed engagement, spinning stories about tragic romance and corporate intrigue. The sound of papers being shuffled reached his ears. "There's also a matter requiring your immediate attention. The lawyers sent over some documents about the company." Alexander's hand tightened on the chair. "Read it." Lisa cleared her throat. "They're requesting your signature to approve a temporary transfer of executive authority to the board while you recover. It's just a formality, they say, to ensure the smooth running of operations." The words hit him like physical blows. He had built Pierce Enterprises from nothing, turning a small software company into a global technology giant. Now they wanted to push him aside, using his condition as an excuse. "Get out," he said quietly. "Mr. Pierce, the lawyers said it's urgent. Get out!" His voice thundered through the apartment. The sound of hurried footsteps and a door closing told him she had fled. Alone again, he tried to steady his breathing. The darkness that had become his constant companion seemed to press in closer, mocking him. He could feel his empire slipping through his fingers like sand, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. His phone buzzed. He had learned to keep it in his pocket, one of the few connections to the world he could still manage. The automated voice read out the caller ID, Victoria Hamilton. He let it ring until it stopped. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unwanted assistance and ignored calls. Lisa returned, speaking in an even more cautious tone, to help with meals he barely tasted and messages he refused to answer. When evening came, he heard her gathering her things. "Mr. Pierce?" Her voice was hesitant. I don't think I can continue this assignment. I'm sorry." He didn't respond, and moments later, the elevator doors dinged shut behind her. Another one gone. They were all leaving. The aides, Victoria, soon the company. His carefully constructed world was unraveling thread by thread. That night, He sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of success he could no longer see. His fingers traced the smooth surface of his desk. Imported African blackwood, he remembered. The detail seemed meaningless now. The phone buzzed again. This time it was his head of legal affairs. "What?" he snapped after accepting the call. "Alex," Richard Morton's voice was grave. "We need to talk about the company. The board met today." "Without you." Alexander's jaw clenched. "I'm still the majority shareholder." "For now," Richard said carefully, "but there's movement to invoke the incapacity clause in the company bylaws. Victoria, she's aligned herself with several board members. They're preparing to argue that your condition makes you unfit to maintain control." The words hung in the air like poison. Victoria. Of course. She had always been ambitious. It was one of the things that had attracted him to her, now that ambition was turned against him like a weapon. "They can't do this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They can, and they will." Richard paused. "Unless you fight back. But Alex, are you sure you're in any condition to handle a corporate battle right now?" The question stung because it hit at his deepest fear. How could he fight when he couldn't even walk across his own apartment without bumping into furniture? How could he maintain control of a global corporation when he needed help just to read his own mail? After ending the call, Alexander sat in the darkness that had become his world. Outside, he could hear the faint sounds of the city. Traffic, sirens, the endless pulse of New York life continuing without him. In his mind's eye, he could see the lights of other skyscrapers, windows glowing like stars. But his own apartment felt like a tomb, silent except for the echo of his breathing. He needed help, but not the kind that came with pitying voices and careful footsteps. He needed someone who would treat him like a person, not a problem to be managed. Someone who wouldn't walk on eggshells around him or flee at his first sharp word. He just didn't know where to find them. Sarah Martinez stood in the marble lobby of the luxury apartment building, her worn shoes a stark contrast against the polished floor. At 34, her face showed the weathering of someone who had seen too many hard years, but her eyes retained a fierce determination. She clutched a piece of paper with the apartment number written on it, wondering if she had finally lost her mind by coming here. "Ms. Martinez," the building manager approached, his expression a mixture of skepticism and disapproval as he looked at her simple clothes. "Mr. Pierce's office confirmed your appointment. However, I must remind you that we have certain standards in this building." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm here for a job interview, not to admire your lobby." Her voice was calm but carried, an edge of steel that made the manager step back slightly. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending to another world. Sarah used the time to straighten her clothes, clean but clearly worn, and think about her children. Tommy, age 8, and Lisa, 6, were staying with her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, while she came to this interview. The thought of them gave her strength. They were the reason she was here, considering a job that seemed more like a fairy tale gone wrong. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. Sarah's first impression was of space, vast and elegant, but somehow hollow. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating artwork that probably cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. "Mr. Pierce?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "In here." The response came from what appeared to be a study. Sarah followed the voice, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Alexander Pierce sat in a leather chair, his unseeing eyes directed toward the windows. Even in his current state, he carried an air of authority that filled the room. But Sarah noticed the slight disarray of his usually impeccable appearance, a crooked tie, an unshaven face, signs that his perfect world was crumbling. "So," he said without turning, "you're the one desperate enough to answer my advertisement." Sarah's chin lifted. "And you're the one desperate enough to post it." A surprised laugh escaped him, harsh but genuine. "Direct, aren't you? The agency said you have no experience as a personal aide." "I have experience keeping difficult people alive," she replied. "I worked in a nursing home for 3 years before it closed down. Before that, I cleaned houses, and I'm raising 2 kids on my own. I know how to handle challenges." He turned then, his blank eyes somehow finding her general direction. "And you think I'm just another challenge? I think you're a man who needs help, but doesn't want to be treated like he's helpless." She paused, then added, "I'm also a woman who needs a job but doesn't want to be treated like she's worthless." Silence filled the room. Sarah waited, standing her ground. She had learned long ago that backing down only invited people to push harder. "The job requirements are extensive," he finally said. "Live-in position, 6 days a week, basic nursing duties, household management, personal assistance. The previous aides found it overwhelming." "The previous aides probably had somewhere else to go," Sarah responded. "I'll be direct, Mr. Pierce. I have 2 children who need a roof over their heads and food on their table. The shelter where we've been staying has a 2-week limit which ends this Friday. I'm not here because I want to be your Florence Nightingale. I'm here because we both have something the other needs." Another silence. But this one felt different. Sarah could almost see him reassessing her, measuring her words against some internal standard. "Your children," he said finally. "They would need to stay here too." "Yes. They're well-behaved and quiet. They understand how to live in other people's spaces." The words tasted bitter. They had learned that lesson in too many temporary homes. Alexander stood, his movements careful but deliberate. "The salary is substantial, but the work won't be easy. I'm not a pleasant man on my best days, and lately I haven't had many of those." "I don't need you to be pleasant," Sarah replied. "I need you to be fair. I'll do my job and I'll do it well. But I won't be bullied, and I won't let my children feel unwelcome in their own home." To her surprise, a slight smile crossed his face. "You know who I am, don't you? What I was before." "Yes. I also know what you are now. A man who needs help getting dressed in the morning and someone to read his mail to him. The rest doesn't matter much in this room, does it?" The smile disappeared, but something like respect flickered across his features. He moved toward his desk, one hand trailing along the furniture for guidance. "When can you start?" "Today. Our bags are downstairs with the concierge." This time his laugh was genuine, if brief. "You were that sure I'd hire you?" "No," Sarah answered honestly, "but I didn't have the luxury of making other plans." Alexander reached his desk and pressed a button on the phone. "James, please bring up Ms. Martinez's belongings and have housekeeping prepare the guest wing." He paused, then added, 3 beds. As Sarah watched him navigate his way back to his chair, she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or possibly saved it. Either way, there was no turning back now. "One more thing," he said as she turned to leave. "Why did you really come here? The truth this time." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and the powerful persona to the lost man beneath. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "the people who seem to have everything and the people who seem to have nothing are both just trying to survive." He didn't respond, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. Without another word, she left to prepare for her children's arrival, leaving Alexander Pierce alone with thoughts he couldn't see but could finally begin to feel. The first week of their new arrangement proved to be a delicate dance of boundaries and adjustments. Sarah quickly established a routine, but it wasn't without its challenges. Each morning began with a silent battle of wills, Alexander struggling to maintain his independence, while Sarah insisted on helping with tasks he hadn't yet mastered. "Your tie's crooked again," Sarah said one morning, her voice matter-of-fact as she entered his bedroom. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating Alexander standing before his closet, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I can dress myself," he snapped, fingers fumbling with the silk tie. "Of course you can," Sarah replied, calmly, "just like I can probably figure out how to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But since neither of us has the time for trial and error today, let me help." Her hands were efficient and impersonal as she straightened his tie, but Alexander could smell the faint scent of coffee and children's breakfast cereal that clung to her clothes. It was so different from Victoria's expensive perfume that it made his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The children, surprisingly, proved to be the easiest part of the transition. Tommy and Lisa moved through the vast apartment like quiet shadows, their natural exuberance tempered by years of learning to exist in spaces that weren't their own. But occasionally, their presence brought unexpected moments of lightness too. The heavy atmosphere. "Mr. Pierce?" Lisa's small voice caught him one afternoon as he sat in his study. "I drew a picture. Mommy says I should describe it to you." Alexander tensed, unused to such direct interaction with children. "You don't have to." "It's a unicorn," she continued, undeterred. "But it's wearing a business suit like yours, and it has a cell phone. Tommy says unicorns don't use phones, but I think they would if they had important business meetings." A startled laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "A business unicorn? That's creative. I used the gold crayon for its horn because Mommy says you like expensive things." There was no judgment in her voice, just childish observation. "Do you want to feel the paper? I pressed really hard so you can feel the lines." Before he could respond, her small hand was guiding his fingers across the textured surface of the drawing. For a moment, his throat closed up entirely. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sharp ring of his phone. "Victoria Hamilton," the automated voice announced. Lisa's hand withdrew immediately. "I'll go get Mommy," she whispered, already retreating. Sarah appeared moments later as he was still staring at the phone in his hand. "Do you want to take it?" "No," he said firmly, but then hesitated. "Yes, I should know what she's planning." Sarah's footsteps moved away, giving him privacy, but he could sense her hovering just outside the door as he answered the call. "Alexander," Victoria's voice was smooth as ever. "The board is concerned about your extended absence." "I'm sure." "They are," he replied coldly, "almost as concerned as you were about our engagement." "Don't be bitter, darling. It doesn't suit you." A pause. "I hear you've hired new help, a woman with children. Really, Alexander, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's none of your business anymore." But her words had struck a nerve. What was he thinking? Filling his pristine apartment with a struggling, single mother and her children. "The board meets next week," Victoria continued as if he hadn't spoken. "They're voting on implementing the incapacity clause. It would be better if you attended to show you're being reasonable about the transition." "Reasonable?" His voice rose. "You mean compliant? You want me to sit there and nod while you take my company?" "Your company?" Her laugh was sharp. "Look at yourself, Alexander. You can't hive and dress properly without help. How do you expect to run a global corporation?" The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Alexander's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Mr. Pierce," Sarah's voice cut through his rising anger. "Tommy made lunch. He insists you try his special sandwich." "I have to go," he told Victoria abruptly and ended the call. "The sandwich can wait," he said to Sarah, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "No, it can't," she replied firmly, "because my 8-year-old son spent 20 minutes making it perfect and he's proud of it. You can sit here and let Victoria Hamilton feed your bitterness, or you can come have lunch with people who don't care about your stock portfolio." The bluntness of her words shocked him out of his dark thoughts. "You don't understand what's at stake. I understand that you're letting fear of losing your company blind you to the life that's still in front of you." Her voice softened slightly. "The sandwich has peanut butter and banana. Tommy says it's what Elvis ate, though I'm pretty sure he got that from a cartoon." Alexander stood, his movements uncertain but determined. "Lead the way," he said quietly. As they walked to the kitchen, he could hear the children's excited whispers and the rustle of paper napkins being arranged just so. These small sounds of life had begun to fill the empty spaces of his apartment, replacing the echoing silence that had threatened to consume him. "3 steps down," Sarah murmured, her hand ghosting near his elbow but not quite touching. She had learned quickly that he preferred minimal assistance, just enough to prevent accidents without making him feel invalid. Seated at his expensive dining table, eating a slightly squashed peanut butter and banana sandwich made by small, earnest hands, Alexander Pierce felt something shift inside him. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But perhaps it was the beginning of understanding that while some doors in his life had closed, others might be opening, if he could find the courage to walk through them. The morning of the board meeting dawned with an air of impending battle. Sarah found Alexander already awake in his study, impeccably dressed in a suit she had laid out the night before. His fingers traced the edge of his desk repeatedly, a nervous gesture she had begun to recognize. "You're up early," she said, setting down his coffee exactly 3 inches from his right hand, the position they had agreed upon after several spilled cups in the first week. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, his voice tight. "The board meeting's at 9. Sarah paused in her morning routine. Over the past 3 weeks, she had learned to read the subtle tensions in his voice, the way his shoulders set when he was preparing for a fight. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No." He reached for the coffee, his movements precise now after weeks of practice. "But I need you to help me prepare. Read me the latest quarterly reports again." She picked up the folders, arranged exactly as she had left them the night before. As she read through the numbers, she could see him transforming, his posture straightening, his jaw setting, in a familiar expression of determination. This was the Alexander Pierce that had built an empire, and he was preparing to defend it. "Mr. Pierce," Tommy's voice interrupted from the doorway, "can I show you something before you go?" Alexander's expression softened slightly, a change so subtle that Sarah wondered if anyone else would have noticed it. Over the past weeks, her son had developed an unexpected bond with the businessman, bringing him small treasures and discoveries that he described in careful detail. "Make it quick, Tommy," Sarah started to say, but Alexander held up a hand. "I have time," he said, surprising her. "What is it?" Tommy approached, holding something in his hands. "I did research for my school project about how blind people read. Look, feel this." He took Alexander's hand and placed something under his fingers. "It's Braille. I made it with my craft set. It says Pierce." Alexander's fingers moved over the raised dots, his expression unreadable. "You made this?" "Yeah, I thought maybe I could help make labels for stuff in your office, so you could find things easier." Tommy's voice was hopeful but uncertain. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Sarah watched as Alexander's fingers continued to trace the dots, seeing something shift in his face, a crack in the corporate armor he had been building all morning. "Thank you, Tommy," he said finally, his voice rough. That would be very helpful." After Tommy left, Sarah noticed Alexander slipping the small piece of paper into his suit pocket. She pretended not to see. "The reports," he said, his voice professional again, but something had changed in his demeanor. "Continue." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. As they waited for his driver, Sarah straightened his tie one last time. "Remember," she said quietly, "they expect you to be broken. Use that." He turned toward her voice, surprised. "Speaking from experience?" "Let's just say I know what it's like to have people underestimate you." She stepped back, professional distance returning to her voice. "Your car's here." The hours after he left crawled by with excruciating slowness. Sarah kept herself busy with housework and helping the children with their homework, but her mind kept returning to the board meeting. She had seen the documents, read the emails. She knew what Victoria and the board were planning. It was late afternoon when she heard the elevator. Alexander's footsteps were measured, controlled, but she could sense the tension radiating from him as he entered. "How bad?" she asked simply. "They've called for a vote of no confidence," he said, his voice flat. Victoria presented a comprehensive plan for transitioning the company leadership. She had it all prepared. Charts showing how my condition would impact investor confidence, statistics about disability and executive function, even testimonials from concerned shareholders. Sarah watched as he moved to the window, his hand finding the glass with practiced ease. "And? The vote is next week. Richard thinks..." He stopped, his jaw working. "My own lawyer thinks I should consider stepping down voluntarily to preserve some dignity and my remaining shares. What do you think?" He turned toward her voice, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his expression. "I think I'm about to lose everything I've spent my life building." Sarah stepped closer. Close enough that he could sense her presence. "No," she said firmly. You're about to find out what you can build without being able to see it first. There's a difference." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Always so certain, aren't you? What makes you such an expert on losing everything and starting over?" "Because I've done it," she said quietly. 3 years ago I had a good job, a nice apartment, a husband who seemed perfect on paper. Then the market crashed. My husband left when his startup failed, leaving me with all his debts. The nursing home where I worked closed down. Within 6 months, I was living in my car with 2 small children, trying to figure out how to make $3 stretch into dinner for 3 people. The silence that followed her words was heavy with unspoken understanding. "How did you do it?" he asked finally. "Start over?" "One day at a time. One small victory at a time." She moved to stand beside him at the window. "The day I figured out how to get Tommy into school without a permanent address, that was a victory. The day I learned how to repair Lisa's only pair of shoes with duct tape and determination, that was a victory. The day I swallowed my pride and took a job cleaning houses for people who used to be my neighbors, that was the biggest victory of all." Alexander's hand found the window frame, gripping it tightly. "It's different." "Is it? You're facing the same choice I did. You can let them take everything from you, or you can redefine what everything means." He turned toward her voice, his expression intense. "Why do you care? This job, if I lose the company, you'll lose this position." "Because," Sarah said slowly, "my children look at you differently than they've looked at anyone since their father left. Tommy spends hours working on Braille labels because he believes in you. Lisa draws you pictures because she thinks you're lonely. They see something in you that's worth believing in, and I've learned to trust their judgment." The sound of children's laughter drifted in from another room, a reminder of the life that had slowly begun to fill the empty spaces of the penthouse. "I should prepare for next week," Alexander said finally, but his voice had lost some of its despair. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but first Lisa made cupcakes in her easy-bake oven. They're probably terrible, but she's very proud of them." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Worse than Tommy's Elvis sandwich?" "Nothing could be worse than that sandwich," Sarah said seriously, but she was smiling too. "Come on, one small victory at a time, remember?" As they walked toward the kitchen, Sarah realized something had shifted between them. A wall had come down. A truth had been shared. Whether it would help him save his company remained to be seen, but perhaps he was finally beginning to understand that some things worth fighting for couldn't be measured in stock prices or board votes. The discovery happened by accident. Sarah was organizing Alexander's home office, something she did every Friday afternoon, when she found the old newspaper clipping tucked away in a drawer. She might have overlooked it entirely if her own father's name hadn't caught her eye. Martinez. Technology Solutions closes doors after Pierce Enterprises acquisition. Her hands trembled as she read the 5-year-old article. The story was familiar, she had lived it, but seeing it in black and white made her stomach clench. Her father's small but successful software company had been one of many that Pierce Enterprises had absorbed during its aggressive expansion phase. The merger had been presented as a partnership opportunity, but in reality, it had been a hostile takeover that left her father's company stripped for assets and its employees jobless. "Sarah?" Alexander's voice came from the doorway. "Is everything all right? You've been quiet for a while." She looked up at him, grateful for once that he couldn't see her face. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice betrayed her. He moved into the room, his steps careful but confident now, after weeks of learning the layout. "You're not fine. What's wrong?" "I found something," she said finally. "A newspaper article about Martinez Technology Solutions." His body went rigid. "Your father's company." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her breath catch. "You knew?" "I had my lawyers do a background check when I hired you." His voice was carefully neutral. "The name was familiar, but I didn't make the connection immediately. There were so many acquisitions back then. So many lives affected," Sarah said quietly. "My father's company employed 37 people. They all lost their jobs. Dad had a heart attack 6 months later from the stress." Alexander sank into his chair, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I didn't know about your father. The acquisitions, they were business decisions, numbers on paper. They weren't just numbers, Sarah's voice cracked slightly. That company was everything to my father. He built it from nothing, just like you did with Pierce Enterprises. The difference is, he cared about his people. He took out loans to try to keep paying their salaries even after the takeover. Those debts, she stopped, swallowing hard. Those debts are why you and your children ended up homeless, Alexander finished quietly. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. A heavy silence filled the room. Alexander's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Why did you take this job? You must have known who I was. I knew exactly who you were, Sarah admitted. I took the job because I needed it, because my children needed it, and maybe part of me wanted to see the great Alexander Pierce up close, to understand the man who could ruin so many lives without a second thought. And now, his voice was strained. What do you see now? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. The proud businessman who had lost his sight, the difficult patient who had learned to accept help, the lonely man who had begun to smile at her children's small kindnesses. I see someone who's learning the same lesson my father learned, she said finally, that everything you build can be taken away in an instant. The only difference is what you choose to build next. Alexander's face showed a flash of pain. Victoria called this afternoon. The board vote, it's been moved up. They're meeting tomorrow. So soon? Sarah felt her anger at the past, temporarily displaced by concern for the present. They think they have the votes to force me out. His laugh was bitter. Apparently, several major shareholders received anonymous information about past aggressive takeovers, stories about families affected, businesses destroyed, like your father's. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Victoria? Most likely. She always was thorough in her research. He paused. The irony isn't lost on me. The same tactics I used to build my empire are being used to take it away. What will you do? He turned his face toward the window, though he could no longer see the view. What can I do? Fight back with secrets of my own? Play their game of corporate warfare? I'm not even sure I want to anymore. Sarah moved closer, her earlier anger warring with a new understanding. Then don't play their game, play a different one. What do you mean? You built Pierce Enterprises by seeing opportunities others missed. You can't see with your eyes anymore, but maybe that's not the kind of vision you need right now. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Your father, he said finally. Tell me about him. Not the businessman, the person, the father, the man who cared about his employees. Sarah blinked, surprised by the request. He used to know everyone's names, not just his employees, their spouses, their children. Every Friday, he'd bring in pastries from this tiny bakery that was struggling to stay open. He said it was because they were the best in town, but I later found out he was helping the owner pay for his daughter's college tuition. And after the takeover, he never blamed you, actually, Sarah said softly. He said that's just how business works, but he did say something I never forgot. He said the true measure of a business isn't in its profit margins, but in how many lives it makes better. Alexander's hands relaxed slightly on his chair. Your children, he said suddenly. These past weeks, they've never once looked at me with resentment. They should, given what I did to their grandfather's legacy, but they don't. Children see things differently, Sarah replied. They see who people are trying to become, not who they used to be. He stood abruptly, moving with surprising sureness to his desk. I need you to help me prepare some documents. If I'm going to lose my company tomorrow, I want it to be on my terms, not Victoria's. What are you planning? A different kind of vision, he said, and for the first time that evening there was something like hope in his voice. One your father might have understood. As Sarah moved to help him, she felt the weight of the newspaper clipping in her. Some hocket. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps the future could still be rewritten. The Pierce Enterprises boardroom fell silent as Alexander entered, his hand resting lightly on Sarah's arm for guidance. The confidence in his stride betrayed none of the tension she could feel in his grip. Victoria's subtle intake of breath was the only indication of her surprise at Sarah's presence. "Mr. Pierce," someone began, "this is a closed board meeting. Your assistant should wait outside." "Ms. Martinez stays," Alexander said firmly, finding his chair with practiced ease. "As of this morning, she's more than an assistant. She's my proxy for 20% of my voting shares." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel Victoria's sharp gaze on her as she took her seat beside Alexander, the legal documents Richard had prepared at dawn heavy in her hands. "This is highly irregular," Victoria's voice cut through the tension. "The board is here to vote on the implementation of the incapacity clause. Mr. Pierce's attempt to redistribute his shares at this late hour could be seen as an effort to obstruct proper corporate governance." "On the contrary," Alexander replied smoothly, "I'm here to demonstrate exactly how capable I still am of making sound business decisions." He turned his head toward Richard. "Please distribute the proposals." Sarah watched as the board members received their copies, their expressions moving from skepticism to surprise to intense concentration as they read. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands clenched the papers, her knuckles whitening. "This is absurd," she finally said. "You want to restructure the entire company? Create a new division focused on adaptive technology and accessibility solutions? Redirect 30% of our R&D budget to developing products for disabled users?" She laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. "The shareholders will never approve." "Actually," Richard spoke up, "preliminary market analysis suggests the adaptive technology sector is dramatically underserved. There's a potential market of over $1 billion that no major tech company has properly addressed." "And who would lead this new division?" Victoria's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You, Alexander." "No," he said quietly. "I'm stepping down as CEO." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This hadn't been part of their discussion. "But," Alexander continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "not because of my disability. I'm stepping down because Pierce Enterprises needs a different kind of leadership for its next chapter. Leadership that understands that true innovation comes from recognizing human needs, not just market opportunities." He stood, his presence commanding the room despite his unseeing eyes. "I'm nominating Dr. Emily Chen as my successor." The name sent another shockwave through the room. Dr. Chen, a brilliant software engineer who had been quietly leading their research division, was known for her groundbreaking work in adaptive interfaces. She was also the last person anyone had expected Alexander to choose. "Dr. Chen has already accepted," Richard added, "contingent on the board's approval." Victoria's chair scraped back as she stood. "This is a transparent attempt to maintain control through a proxy. The board won't—" "The board will consider what's best for the company's future," one of the older directors interrupted. "And I, for one, am intrigued by this proposal. The adaptive technology market is virtually untapped, and with our resources that would be better spent maintaining our core business," Victoria snapped. "Alexander, be reasonable. You're letting personal circumstances cloud your judgment." "No, Victoria," he replied calmly. "For the first time in years, I'm seeing things clearly. Sarah, would you read the market projection numbers?" As Sarah began to read, she could feel the room's attention shift. The numbers were compelling, not just the market potential, but the human impact. Alexander had spent the night working with Richard to compile statistics about employment rates among disabled individuals, the economic impact of accessible technology, the untapped talent pool that could be reached with the right tools. "There's one more thing," Alexander said when she finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, the Braille label Tommy had made. This was created by an 8-year-old boy who saw a need and tried to fill it. He did more real innovation in an afternoon than we've done in months of R&D meetings. We've forgotten what innovation really means. It's not about buying up competitors or maximizing shareholder value. It's about making lives better. The silence. That followed was different from the one that had greeted their arrival. Sarah could see thoughtful expressions on several board members' faces. Even Victoria seemed temporarily at a loss for words. "I move to vote on the proposals separately," one of the directors finally said, "starting with the new division and leadership transition." "Seconded," another voice quickly added. Victoria's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "You can't seriously be considering—" "We are," the first director cut her off. "And speaking as someone who's watched this company grow for 20 years, I think it's about time we considered a new direction." The voting process took over an hour. Sarah sat beside Alexander, reading him the tallies in a low voice as each proposal was considered. She felt his hand brush against hers when the final votes were counted. Dr. Chen's appointment approved, the new division authorized, the restructuring plan accepted, with minor modifications. "There's still the matter of the incapacity clause," Victoria said tightly, making one last attempt. "I believe that issue is now moot," Richard replied, "given that Mr. Pierce has voluntarily chosen to step down and has demonstrated clear strategic thinking in planning the company's future direction." The meeting ended with Victoria storming out, several board members clustering around Richard to discuss implementation details, and Alexander sitting quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked. Softly. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes. Tommy and Lisa will want to hear how their father's idea helped change a billion-dollar company." Their father's idea. "Well," Alexander stood, offering his arm, "I think your father would have understood what we did here today. Sometimes the best way to build something new is to first admit that your old way of seeing things was wrong." As they left the boardroom, Sarah realized that while one chapter of their story was ending, another was just beginning. And this time both of them were facing the future with their eyes wide open, regardless of who could physically see. The weeks following the board meeting brought subtle but significant changes to life in the penthouse. The most noticeable was Alexander himself. The sharp edges of his personality had begun to soften, replaced by something more contemplative. Sarah noticed it first in the small things, the way he actually listened during Tommy's excited explanations of his school projects, his genuine interest in Lisa's elaborate stories about her stuffed animals, the gentler tone he used when asking for help. One morning, Sarah found him in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee on his own. The counter was a mess of spilled grounds, but his expression held determination rather than frustration. "You could have called me," she said, moving to help. "I could have," he agreed, "but I needed to prove something to myself." He paused, his hands finding the edge of the counter. "I've been thinking about what you said about small victories." Sarah began cleaning up the spilled coffee, a smile tugging at her lips. "And making a mess of my kitchen counts as a victory." "Your kitchen?" His eyebrow raised, but there was amusement in his voice. "I wasn't aware ownership had transferred." "Well, considering I'm the one who keeps it running." She stopped suddenly, realizing how comfortable their banter had become. When had that happened? Alexander seemed to sense her hesitation. "Sarah," he said, his voice turning serious, "we need to talk about your position here." Her heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong?" No, quite the opposite. He moved to sit at the kitchen island, his movements now confident in the familiar space. "With the company changes, my role will be different, less demanding. I won't need a full-time assistant anymore." Sarah felt her throat tighten. After everything they'd been through, was this how it would end? "I see," she managed to say. "I'll start looking for new arrangements." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, reaching out until his hand found her arm. "I want to offer you a different position. Dr. Chen is looking for someone to head up community outreach for the new division. Someone who understands both the corporate world and the human side of what we're trying to achieve." Sarah stood very still, his hand warm on her arm. "Me? But I don't have the qualifications." "You have exactly the qualifications we need. You understand what it's like to fall through society's cracks. You know how to build bridges between different worlds." He paused. And you've proven you're not afraid to stand up to powerful people when necessary." A laugh escaped her, though. It sounded shaky even to her ears. "Is that what you call what happened in the boardroom? I call it showing more business acumen than half my former board members." His expression grew thoughtful. "You know, when I first lost my sight, I thought it was the end of everything. I couldn't imagine how I would continue. But sometimes, losing one kind of vision gives you another." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. The morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows caught the silver in his hair, softened the lines of his face. He looked younger somehow, unburdened. "The children," she said finally, "they've just started to feel stable here. They'll stay, of course, all of you will." He hesitated. "Unless you want different arrangements, the salary for the new position would certainly allow you to find your own place." "No," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, the children are settled here. It would be disruptive to move them now." "Just the children." His voice was carefully neutral, but something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "Before," she could respond, they heard the pattering of feet approaching. "Mum, Mr. Pierce." Tommy burst into the kitchen, waving a paper. "I got an A on my science project, the one about adaptive technology." Alexander's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Tell me about it." As Tommy launched into an excited explanation about his presentation on Braille displays and voice recognition software, Sarah watched the man who had once been the feared CEO of Pierce Enterprises lean forward with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement. Lisa wandered in during the explanation, still in her pajamas, clutching her favorite stuffed unicorn, the one she had given a tiny business suit drawn with markers. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the stool next to Alexander, leaning against his arm as she listened to her brother. He adjusted his position slightly to accommodate her, the movement so natural it seemed unconscious. The scene struck Sarah with unexpected force. This makeshift family they had somehow created, built not on blood or obligation, but on something else entirely, something that had grown so gradually she hadn't noticed until this moment. "Sarah," Alexander's voice broke into her. "Thoughts? You're very quiet." "Just thinking," she said softly, "about small victories." His smile told her he understood exactly what she meant. The coffee maker beeped, and Sarah moved to pour cups for both of them, adding cream and sugar to his exactly the way he liked it. As she placed it in his hand, no need to measure the distance anymore, they had done this so many times, their fingers brushed. "About the job offer," she said, watching his expression carefully. "I'll take it on one condition." "Which is?" "You let me teach you to make your own coffee properly. No more countertop disasters." His laugh filled the kitchen, genuine and warm. "Deal, though I should warn you, I'm a terrible student." "No," Sarah said, looking at the man before her, so different from the bitter, angry person she'd met months ago. "I don't think you are. I think you just needed the right teacher." The children had started arguing about whether business unicorns should wear ties or bow ties, their voices filling the kitchen with the kind of casual chaos that had become normal in their unlikely household. Alexander's face held a contentment she had never seen in those early days, and Sarah realized something important. Sometimes the biggest victories come disguised as small moments, like spilled coffee and children's laughter and the quiet understanding that grows between two people who have learned to see the world through each other's eyes. The autumn evening had turned the penthouse windows into mirrors, reflecting the warm interior lights against the darkening sky. Sarah stood in the living room, watching Alexander as he sat at the piano, another small victory in his journey. He had started playing again 2 weeks ago, his fingers remembering what his eyes could no longer see. The melody was something soft and contemplative, not the classical pieces he usually preferred. Sarah recognized it as the lullaby Lisa had been humming all week, though his version was more complex, layered with harmonies that made it sound both familiar and new. "You're hovering," he said without stopping his playing. "Something on your mind?" Sarah smiled, still amazed at how attuned he had become to her presence. "How did your meeting with Dr. Chen go?" The music continued, but she noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "Interesting, she wants to expand the adaptive technology division faster than planned. The market response has been overwhelming." That's good news, isn't it? His fingers stilled on the keys. She wants you to travel to California. 3 months, overseeing the setup of the West Coast operation. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Oh. It's an incredible opportunity, Alexander continued, his voice carefully neutral. You'd be establishing the foundation for our community outreach program across the entire Western region. The position would come with a significant promotion. Sarah moved closer to the piano, noticing how his hands remained on the keys as if anchoring himself. What do you think I should do? I think, he said slowly, that I'm not the right person to advise you on this. My judgment might be compromised. The admission made her breath catch. They had been dancing around this thing between them for weeks, this gradual shift from employer and employee to something neither of them had dared to name. The children are settled in school here, she said, though they both knew that wasn't the real issue. They could finish the semester. The position wouldn't start until January. His fingers pressed down on the keys, producing a soft, discordant note. Sarah, I won't hold you back. You've built something remarkable with the outreach program. The work you're doing is changing lives. I learned from the best, she said softly. A certain businessman showed me that it's never too late to change your vision of success. Alexander turned toward her voice, and even after all these months, the intensity of his unseeing gaze still made her heart race. 3 months is a long time, he said finally. Too long. The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Before he could answer, they heard the elevator doors open. Tommy's excited voice carried down the hallway. Mom, Mr. Pierce, you'll never believe what happened at school today. The moment between them stretched, then shifted as the children burst into the room. Lisa immediately climbed onto the piano bench beside Alexander, her small hand finding his arm with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. Play the princess song again, she demanded, making both adults laugh. Your daughter has expensive taste in music, Alexander told Sarah, his fingers already moving into the opening notes of Lisa's favorite movie soundtrack. She insists on the full orchestral arrangement. I wonder who she learned. That from? Sarah teased, watching as Tommy settled on the floor nearby, pulling out his homework. The scene was so domestic, so natural, it made her chest ache. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah found Alexander in his study. He was running his fingers over a blueprint, one of Tommy's latest Braille projects, she realized. He's getting better at this, Alexander commented. The spacing is almost perfect now. He's determined to label everything in the Tam apartment before he starts on the office building. Sarah, her name was almost a sigh, about California. I don't want to go, she said quickly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. He stood, moving toward her with the confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of the space between them. It's an incredible opportunity, he repeated, but this time there was a question in his voice. There are other opportunities, she said softly. Some things are more important than career advancement. His hand found her arm, the touch sending warmth through her body. I don't want you to resent me later, to feel like you gave up something important because of this arrangement we have. Arrangement? Sarah stepped closer, letting her hand rest over his. Is that what you call this? This family we've built? The word family made him catch his breath. I didn't dare, he started, then stopped. Sarah, when you first came here, I was lost. Not just because of my sight, but because I had spent my whole life looking at the world the wrong way. You and the children. You taught me to see things differently. And you showed us that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead you exactly where you're supposed to be. She moved her hand to his face, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. The children need stability. They need their home, their family. And what do you need? His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah thought about the past months, the gradual transformation of this sterile penthouse into a warm home, the sound of children's laughter mixing with piano music, the quiet evenings sharing coffee and conversation. She thought about the man before her, who had learned to see the world through his heart when his eyes failed him. "I need this," she said simply. "Us. All of us together. Some things are worth more than any promotion." Alexander's free hand found her face, his touch gentle as he traced her features, something he had never done before, though she had seen him wanting to. "I've been afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that I was imagining this thing between us. Afraid that you stayed, out of obligation or gratitude." Sarah leaned into his touch. "When have I ever done anything out of obligation to you?" His laugh was soft and wondering. "Never. From the very first day, you've been the most stubbornly independent person I've ever met." "Then trust me to know my own heart," she said. "California can find someone else to run their program. My place is here." The kiss, when it finally came, felt like coming home, like all the pieces of their broken pasts had been reformed into something beautiful and unexpected. When they parted, Sarah could feel his smile against her lips. "Dr. Chen won't be happy," he murmured. "Dr. Chen can open a video conference center. Modern technology is a wonderful thing." Sarah wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid strength of him against her. "Besides, we have a piano recital to attend next week. Lisa would never forgive us if we missed her debut as a business unicorn princess." His laughter filled the room, mingling with the nighttime sounds of their home, the soft whir of the climate control, the distant hum of the city, the occasional creak of floorboards as the children shifted in their sleep down the hall. "Stay," he whispered, and this time it wasn't a question about California or career opportunities. "Always," she replied, and sealed the promise with another kiss. Spring had transformed the penthouse terrace into a garden of possibilities. Sarah stood by the glass doors, watching as Alexander and Tommy worked together on their latest project, a raised herb garden with braille markers for each plant. Lisa sat nearby, her stuffed unicorn propped up in a tiny business suit. She had convinced Sarah to sew, supervising the operation with all the seriousness a 6-year-old could muster. "The basil goes next to the thyme," Tommy instructed, guiding Alexander's hands to the correct spot. "Because they're friendship plants, they grow better together." "Friendship plants?" Alexander's amused voice carried across the terrace. "I don't remember reading that in any gardening manual." "It's basic plant science, Mr. Pierce," Lisa chimed, in with authority. "Just like how unicorns make the best CEOs because they can see magic in everything." Sarah smiled, remembering how different this terrace had looked a year ago. Pristine, elegant, and utterly lifeless. Now it was a cheerful mess of learning and growth, much like their lives had become. The transformation of Pierce Enterprises had exceeded everyone's expectations. Under Dr. Chen's leadership, with Sarah's community outreach program flourishing, the company had become a pioneer in adaptive technology. But the real success stories weren't in the profit margins or stock prices. They were in the letters that arrived daily, telling of lives changed by technology that made the world more accessible. "Mom," Tommy called out, "we need your expert opinion. Mr. Pierce thinks we should add vegetables, but I say herbs are more sophisticated." "Herbs are definitely more sophisticated," Sarah agreed, moving to join them. "But maybe we could spare one corner. 4 cherry tomatoes. Some things are worth making space for." Alexander's hand found hers as she knelt beside him, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of shared life. "Speaking of making space," he said, "Tommy has some news he wants to share." Tommy straightened up, practically vibrating with excitement. "I got into the Young Inventors program. They loved my Braille labeling system design." "Of course they did." Sarah pulled him into a hug, soil-covered hands and all. "You've been working so hard on it." "Dr. Chen wants to develop it further," Alexander added. "She thinks it could be the foundation for a whole new line of educational tools." Lisa scooted closer, not wanting to be left out. "Can my unicorn be the company mascot? She already has the right outfit." "I think that's an excellent business proposal," Alexander said seriously. "We should discuss it over our special Friday night dinner. Speaking of which," he turned his face toward Sarah, "I believe we have an announcement of our own to make." Sarah's hand instinctively went to the elegant ring on her finger. Not a traditional engagement ring, but a simple band with a pattern of raised dots that spelled out family in Braille. Alexander had proposed last week, during one of their evening piano sessions, with both children as conspiratorial witnesses. "Can I tell them? Please?" Lisa bounced with anticipation. They had decided to wait for the right moment to share the news with their extended circle. "Tell them at dinner," Sarah suggested, "when everyone's here." The guest list for their regular Friday gatherings had grown over the months. Dr. Chen often joined them, bringing her wife and their teenage son. Richard came with his family, and several other colleagues had become regular additions. Even some of the board members, the ones who had supported Alexander's vision for change, occasionally stopped by. Victoria, they had heard, had taken a position with a rival company on the West Coast. Her departure had been quiet, her ambitions redirected elsewhere. Sometimes Sarah wondered if she ever regretted her choices, ever looked back at the life she had planned with Alexander, and questioned her decision to leave when things got difficult. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Alexander's voice brought her back to the present. "Just thinking about how life surprises you," she said, watching as the children returned to their gardening project. "A year ago, I was desperate enough to answer an advertisement that seemed too good to be true. And I was bitter enough to think I could buy companionship without risking my heart." He pulled her closer. "We were both wrong, in the best possible way." Tommy's voice interrupted their moment. "Mom, Mr. Pierce, look what we found!" He was holding up an earthworm, his sister squealing in delighted disgust. "I can't look, Tommy," Alexander reminded him with a laugh. "But why don't you describe it to me?" What followed was an extremely detailed and somewhat imaginative description of the earthworm's features, including several characteristics Sarah was quite sure earthworms didn't possess. Lisa contributed her own theories about whether worms would wear business suits if they worked in offices. As the afternoon sun bathed the terrace in golden light, Sarah looked at her family, her brilliant, compassionate son who saw problems as opportunities to help others, her imaginative daughter who believed even unicorns could be CEOs, and the man beside her who had learned that losing his sight had somehow helped him see more clearly than ever before. "I love you," she whispered to Alexander, quiet enough that the children wouldn't hear. His hand tightened on hers, and the smile that spread across his face was brighter than any success he had achieved in his years of building his empire. "I love you too," he murmured back. "All of this, the kids, the garden, the chaos, the love. It's better than any vision I ever had for my life." Later that evening, as their extended family gathered for dinner, with Lisa proudly announcing their engagement to enthusiastic congratulations, Sarah watched Alexander listening to the joyful chaos around him. His face held a contentment that had nothing to do with corporate success or material wealth. He had learned, as she had, that true richness came from the connections you built, the lives you touched, and the love you were brave enough to accept. Tommy was explaining his invention to Dr. Chen, his hands moving animatedly as he described his plans for expanding the system. Lisa was showing her unicorn CEO to Richard's youngest daughter, who was completely enchanted by the tiny business suit. The terrace garden's herbs added fresh fragrance to the dishes on the table, and the spring breeze carried the promise of more seasons of growth to come. "Happy?" Alexander asked softly, finding her hand under the table. Sarah looked at their intertwined fingers, at the braille ring that symbolized their unique love story. "Yes," she said simply. "More than I ever imagined possible." "Good," he replied, and his smile held all the light she would ever need to see by. "So am I." Together they had learned that sometimes the clearest vision comes from the heart, and that the most precious things in life can't be seen with eyes at all. They had built something remarkable, not an empire of wealth and power, but a kingdom of love, understanding, and second chances. And in the end, that was the greatest success story of all.